A greeting to those of you who are watching on YouTube. Thanks for being a part of this, and also another good morning to those of you who are here with me in person in the room, and then anybody who might be watching around on campus. I'm excited to be here this morning. I have wrestled, this is ironic, with the topic of surrender. No, nobody gets it. Okay. And so much for that humor. And I decided I was going to start with a resource that has just become familiar to me. And if you don't know this, this is, I guess, an unabashed commercial for somebody's beautiful work. The author's name is Charlie Mackesy, and I understand that Charlie was already a noted artist from Britain before his text here launched him into greater public awareness. And most recently, Apple TV Network has released a short video, which I think took an Academy Award in animation. A short video that's based on this particular book. This book is so lovely, and it has a curious title, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. And if it calls to mind Pooh, I think that's actually not a bad association. It's an astonishingly creative rendering of a story about a boy, a mole, a fox, and a horse. And I happened to take it with me, this text with me, to the women's unit earlier this week when I was working with a group, and I knew I was headed towards the topic of surrender this week. And in flipping through the text, I found a couple of pages. I'm just going to reference one at the moment here. Here the boy is sitting on the horse with the mole in hand and the fox alongside. And the boy asks the horse, "What is the bravest thing you have ever said?" "Help," said the horse. I don't know if it's hard for you to ask for help, but it surely has been a thing I've had to learn to do in my many years of sobriety. And I continue to wrestle with surrender, to struggle with asking for help, and to have to locate myself somewhere on a continuum between clearly not surrendered and sort of exhibiting conduct and attitude that would properly be identified with the disposition of surrender and recovery. So I do wrestle with messages every week, and in my reflections on the theme and subject of surrender this week, one of the things that came to my mind was that it is both similar and different when we use the word surrender to refer to military and, let's say, spiritual application. So there are military surrenders, which I envision a white flag and a devastated battlefield, with sadly corpses and strewn buildings, the way we see in the news now all the time in the Ukraine or in Sudan or whatever. And we don't see any surrender on those platforms at the moment. And then the surrender that's referred to in wisdom traditions in Christianity, I think very much so in Hinduism and Buddhism, and I suspect in the other traditions of the world, if we would look in a desire to sort of see if this is a universal theme. I think it is. I think that spiritual surrender is a thing. And I want to compare and contrast. So I think one of the things that's common about militaristic and spiritual surrender is that both are relatively unpopular. And so I think it's hard to make the case to people that surrender on the battlefield of the military sort of landscape is a good thing. And I think it's also hard on the battlefield of the war of addiction in our individual or family life. Surrender doesn't sound great. I think there's shame associated with surrender. I remember a bumper sticker somebody had, "Rehab is for quitters." It's as if there's something wrong with people who give up. But the horse says the bravest thing he's ever done is ask for help, right? And so what we're talking about is something that will not be popular, perhaps even with ourselves, but certainly with the public eye. And this is a hurdle, right? You have to decide whether you're willing to undertake a path that is not one that the media and marketing and hype and conditioning that we have would urge us to see as attractive or even winning in that dark way that term was used a number of years ago. So yeah, it's difficult for that reason. And I think another reason why, or a way in which the two compare is that both at the military level and at the individual level, or the social level, surrender is a path to the end of conflict. And that's what, to me, makes it so appealing, because the AA expression is, are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? And I would ask you to just make a quick, heart check. Are you depleted? Are you exhausted? Are you kind of fed up with the drama and the gerbil wheel and the bang your head against the wall-ness of what it is to live in the cycle of this phenomenon? It's one of the common characteristics of people who end up in these red chairs is that addiction has visited you, and once it comes, it's like the relative that stays way too long. It becomes an unwelcome guest. And so I think it's quite likely, if you're a patient with a wristband, or you're a loved one, if you're sitting here in the scope of this audience, that you're probably a good person to think, I'm fed up and I would like an end to the conflict. And so it is, by the way, important for me to share that surrender presents itself not only on the grand scale, but in this very real way in which the battlegrounds that we have been facing that bring us into relationship together are. Surrender is an option. And it may even be the only option, although I don't know that people are ready to really see that. But I deeply think that there's a truth to that. I think that there's a point at which what becomes, this is the old thinking that you have to hit a bottom, and then the counter argument in AA is that every bottom I hit had a trapdoor in it, and so it's like, how low do you want to go? If you are going to elect not to choose the path of surrender, you probably do have the option of further, deeper, and worse suffering. But, so I wanted to say this is an occasion of last resort, but darkly, I'm sad to say it isn't. It's like I've watched people get invited to surrender and encouraged to surrender and on the brink of surrender, and then just pick up the sword and, try and wage their battle again. But if there is a difference between the military and the spiritual surrender, I've already hinted at it, but it's the scale and context of the two. And there's a piece that goes with that. So the military surrender happens on what I'm going to call the population level. It's a thing that, although it may be initiated by sinister characters, it is, and then decided on by bodies, if we were to give Senate the option of actually having those powers back. Though individuals may start it, it affects huge numbers of people in a way that's kind of hard to locate the individual within it. And I think that's one of the reasons why war becomes possible, is that sadly people who are not going to end up on the battlefield make decisions about deciding to enter into the theater of war. They call it a theater because somehow they forget that their own children or their own loved ones may be the caskets that are coming home to the Dover Air Force Base. And there's an anonymity about this issue of we're not surrendering or we are surrendering when it's at the population level. But we can't pretend that that's applicable in this situation. In fact, one of the things that I get really frustrated about is addiction policy making that's made at the population level, because it's generally terribly unwise. Things that were launched 40 years ago, like Just Say No or mandatory minimum sentences, were unbelievably, I'll say it, stupid and completely ineffectual. But today, the other thing we have is we have all kinds of policy coming out of the federal government that's done based on numbers and trying to prevent opioid deaths, which is worthwhile, except that it's a skewed statistic. Skewed by the presence of Narcan, and also by the reality that the cost of addiction is way more than the death of those who take opioids. And your, alcohol, benzos, crystal meth, all these different substances, and gambling, and sex addiction, and pornography, and all those different manifestations of this kind of phenomenon get missed when the National Institute of Drug Abuse is focused on reducing opioid deaths as its single marker of success or failure. When you don't really care singularly about that, you care about your loved one or about yourself, I hope. And so the issue of whether you will surrender or acquiesce in addiction recovery is not a population level issue, it's a personal issue. It has to do with you and with the people immediately around you. And if this battle continues, you will suffer and the people immediately around you will suffer, and eventually you can get to the point where it looks like the military battlefield. There are dead bodies, and there are broken structures, and there is finally a white flag, like, help! And I don't know if you're yet there, but I want to invite the entertaining of that movement out of the insanity of the gerbil wheel of a family caught up in this, or just a person who's, left the family environment long ago. There are probably some of those in this room too, but most of the people who get to Caron still have some quasi-intact family structure around them that's hurting as well. And what I also thought was interesting this week about this is that then, in trying to make the turn here to whatever will be the finish of this message, is I was thinking about the language that medicine is using right now to describe the phenomenon that brings people here. And it's not addiction, it's not alcoholism, it's not, it's not junkie, it's not, and all of those, I think, I struggle with the pejorativeness of it. So in an attempt to be less pejorative, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5 went to identifying the phenomenon that brings people to addiction treatment as a use disorder. So we're disordered in our use. I'm one of them. I suffer from a use disorder. Probably many of us suffer from use disorders, even those who are not in treatment. And then the other disorder that often gets attacked, that's a funny verb, but it's attachment disorder. So, and they're close cousins. The people who have a substance use disorder frequently exhibit attachment disorder, and the people who love people with use disorders have attachment disorders because that's the family side of this thing. So, my predecessor in the role as lead at Chapel here, Father Bill, used to put them together, and he used to do talks very frequently on a Thursday morning in which he would write on the chalkboard substances, relationships, and behaviors. And those three categories are all candidates in which the addictive phenomenon will present itself. So, I don't mean to get too teachy this morning, but disordered relationships, and whether it's substances or relationships or other behaviors like compulsivity disorders, gambling, like those are, they call them process addictions. The terminology gets convoluted quickly, but the reality is that the person and the family system around them have made they have sought help from toxic helps. They have looked in the pill bottle. They have looked on the internet gaming or the internet casino thing. Oh my God, that's just like on every commercial in Pennsylvania. I don't know why it's legal for us to be inundated with an addictive thing. I just am, that's another sidebar, sorry. Squirrel. But what is happening is disordered use of relationships, behaviors, and substances. And the family member is like, yes, my loved one is totally disordered in their use of these things. I would take a look in the mirror because, unfortunately, you have not known how to navigate in the context of the identified patient in the system, which is not navigating well. So the disorder is a common shared affliction. I think it's very hard for people sometimes to come around to seeing it as a systemic problem. It's much easier to go, our musician is messed up. I didn't say your name, yay. And, or I'm messed up, rather than we weren't doing well together, and as a result, I became messed up in this particular way. So, and why I focus on the use is that the nature of surrender in the individual sense, well, there's an analogy to the military sense, but is to stop the use of unhealthy and toxic connectedness and to seek higher, better authority, better, higher, healthier connectedness. It's an exchange, really. It's not a departure from being in struggle. It's a decision to approach struggle with a new set of resources. And so to cope without cocktails and to face adversity without a bender or a spree, and to exist in the context of celebration or suffering without a hookup. It's a decision as we face the individual incremental moments of our lives to approach what we use to be that which will have better outcomes than the things that we were using before. And I think now it sounds like, oh great, that's what I want. I want to swap from things I've been relying on that are awful, until somebody says something like, well, what we're talking about is God and love. And then we're like, yeah. And I don't know why. I don't know why the exchange becomes so unappealing and unattractive. But that's what the exchange really is, the extraction, the attraction. The most poetic way I could think of to articulate it today was to talk about going from using to being of use. And I have no good explanation for why we are reluctant to use that as the ruler, the measuring stick, to guide our individual day-to-day lives. But I believe, were we to say, given a panoply of choices, which ones would be able to be conceived as me being of use rather than as using, of service rather than exploitation, of charity rather than self-obsession, this whole world in which we live would change. Not just the addiction landscape, but I think the whole world would change. Were we to begin to use that as a measuring stick for how to navigate choice in life. And the horse's question, help, gets me to have you be of service. But then the epitome of that is when maybe the bravest thing I can say is, what can I do for you? And I don't know that sounds very surrendered, but it's a great take instead of what can you do for me? And this is what I believe, I think this captures the turn of a surrendered life. I've often tried to think, because we get this question all the time. It's almost like, have you been saved? Is the question in the, this weird subset of the Christian thought world. But in the addiction world, it's like, have you surrendered? And it's as if there are those who have and will never need to worry about it again because they just are, and those who are not, and we just need to pity them, right? And it's not a binary, it's rather an adoption of a disposition and a way of approaching life. And sadly, I will tell you, I'm 34 years without a drink, don't applaud, because I'm shocked at it, not only, and I'm grateful for it, but I can measure the spiritual integrity of my decades of sobriety based on this metric that I'm talking about. And there were times in my sobriety when I've drifted back into self-centeredness, and it's all about me, and what about my needs, and why can't I get this or that? And I'm terribly embarrassed. I've done the most harm in my sobriety, more harm I think than I did in my drunkenness, because sadly I could at least say, well, I was intoxicated. But now, with no drugs on board, I've careened off into self-centeredness. Various epics in the 34-year journey. This is Jack's confession day. And I've come to a practice which is in the morning every day to pray that I would be of use. And I think it's helped me immensely. And I think it's beguilingly simple and yet really hard to live. Because I think that we're probably, I suspect it's a deep survival mechanism. That if we're threatened at the lowest level, we will sacrifice family interests and mutual interests and try to get ours. But I think when we're getting ours at the expense of others, meeting their needs, we've moved away from the prosocial human that is the height of the very best of what human beings can be, to the primitive reptilian dog-eat-dog, eat your young, like kind of grim, base realities that are out there in the world for us to see that we don't admire and aspire to. So, back to the boy, the mole, the fox, and the horse. When have you been at your strongest? Asked the boy. When I have dared to show my weakness, said the horse. He continues, asking to help isn't giving up. It's refusing to give up. Asking for help isn't giving up. And being of help is not weak either. This is why we are here. We are here to be of service to one another. And I mean that in the very, very mystical, global, universal way, but I also mean it in the very practical sense of Dick Caron and red chairs and Bill Wilson and drug deaths and divorces, and all of the misery has come, in my mind, partly because we've forgotten why we are here, which is to be of service to one another. And I always know yelling is not a good way to persuade people to love, but it's my passion that seeks to sort of call us to account about this sad derailment of our lives. We have become accumulators and users and competitors in a world of abundance and sufficiency. I need to shut up, but I mean, there's enough food to feed people, we just allocate it wrong. There's enough other resources for us to have enough. If it weren't for the fact that a terribly small number have more than they need. So that's a whole other sermon. God bless you. Thank you for listening. And I seek to be of use to you. How can I help is my question today. God bless you.